mai hana mai, ki te TV, ko te nush taku ingoa.
Kojiani taku ingoa. We have been learning about and conducting scientific research about roto Pupuke as part of our kaupapa to have the roto placed in the protection of the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park. Roto Pupuke is a heart-shaped freshwater lake occupying a volcanic crater between the suburbs of Takapuna and Milford on the north shore of Auckland, New Zealand. The heart shape is a result of its formation by the linking of two circular craters, a larger one forming most of the lake and a smaller one forming the arm in the northeast. Separated from the sea by less than 200 meters at one point, it has a circumference of about 4.5 kilometers and reaches 57 meters in depth. It is popular for recreational activities and is also where we have waterwise.
The project based on the Pupuke initiative has been running since 2017, and recently they have expanded the project to include Lake Rotorua. After 3 years of research and monitoring at Lake Pupuke, they have identified the cause behind the environmental decline seen at the lake. They have collaborated with the local government and national research institutes as well as community groups. They have appeared on several media platforms and now on FHS TV. Their data has formally contributed to official council reports and has been driven better environmental outcomes and awareness for aquatic ecosystems in New Zealand.
This week we have Ibi with us from Project Baseline, but first, let's update our journey from the last few weeks. Ngā Tangaroa Taniwha Forest Hill School has met/interviewed Tom Rowlands from the Auckland Museum, who taught us about food sources and sea life that are being affected by sea urchins and waterways. We also met with Riley Hathaway from Young Ocean Explorers. Their purpose is to help and protect sea life. Their vision is to give children the tools to make a better future for our oceans and stop polluting our oceans. We have also had Dean Ogilvie and Alex Rogers from the Hauraki Gulf Forum.
Taser Proctor from Sustainable Schools taught us how to test the water quality of the lake, and Gordon from Pupuke Waterwise helped us with some questions we had about implicating our science ideas at the lake. Kia ora, Ibi. Mihi koe for joining us today. This is our first ever pre-recorded interview. Could you summarize some of the findings from your research?
Kia ora, and thank you for having me on FHS TV. This is such a cool opportunity to talk to you guys about some of the stuff that we've been doing at Lake Pupuke over the past couple of years. So in summary, our findings are, I think the biggest finding is that the lake has been declining steadily for some time now. And it's not because of one specific impact, but rather an accumulation of many impacts. So one of the things we've been looking at is eutrophication. And this is when nutrients accumulate into the lake, and as the nutrient concentration increases, it reaches a specific level where all of these additional environmental impacts start occurring because of this new nutrient-rich state. So we've been tracking eutrophication at Lake Pupuke since 2017, and many people have been tracking it even longer than that. And what we're finding is that the eutrophication at this lake specifically is not really driven by nutrients coming into the lake from the catchment. So it's not really because of nutrients coming from, say, the housing or roads or any of the activities around the lake, but rather it's nutrients that are coming from within the lake. And this is a cool concept to wrap your head around, because this is kind of the crux of what the biggest issues in this lake is. So nutrients that entered the lake many, many years ago, when there was lots of farming around the lake, they all released phosphorus, and all that phosphorus ended up into the lake, and that settled down in the sediment on the lake bed. And as time went on, environmental conditions changed slightly, and all that nutrients is now coming back into the water. So as that nutrients comes into the water, it creates high amounts of nutrients in the water column, and that causes eutrophication. And this is amplified by other nutrient inputs from within the lake. So as plants die, and you would have seen there's a lot of plants around the sides of the lake, and as they die, they decompose and add nutrients back in, and that also adds to that cycle. So that was one of the findings that we found most interesting, was that the lake was driven from internal nutrient remobilization and not external catchment pressures necessarily. The other summary finding that I think is worth mentioning is the large impact that pest species are having on this lake, and this is dramatic. When you dive in that lake, you really get a first-hand experience of what's going on there, and you can see what these pest species are doing to the system. So, as I mentioned earlier, as plants die, they decompose, and that adds nutrients back into the water. And one of the reasons this is happening is because of the large biomass of pest species, of pest plant species. So you would have noticed along the banks, you see this long eelgrass all over the show, and at some parts of the year it floats up to the surface and banks up against the banks of the lake and starts decomposing. You get a bit of a funny smell. So this is eelgrass, and it's an exotic species that was introduced into the lake, and it occurs in huge biomasses. So this with Aotearoa, which is another really prolific pest species in that lake, cause water to stagnate, so it stops the water flow moving around in the shallow areas, and that creates this oxygen low environment. And then seasonally, these plants die off, and as they die off, all the dead plant material goes back to the sediment onto the lake bed and decomposes, and that pulls more oxygen out the water. So now you've got these big areas of the lake that pretty much nothing can live in because there's no oxygen. And because there's no oxygen, that speeds up this chemical process that puts phosphorus back into the water. So you're getting increased eutrophication and you're getting destruction of habitat for native species. So it's a massive thing for us. The other pest species that are having a huge effect in the lake are pest fish, and particularly coarse fish. So there's a massive amount of perch in that lake, and they've contributed to a decline in most of the native biodiversity, and in some instances, even extinction. So we think one of the reasons why we've lost all freshwater mussels from the lake because of the perch eating all of the bullies. And these bullies act as an intermediate host for these mussels. So without the bullies, the mussels can't reproduce and they will die off. So I think to conclude that, the main points are the eutrophication is driven internally, and the impact from pest species is really dramatic. And those are probably the two biggest issues facing this lake right now.
What was the most surprising discovery from this investigation?
The most interesting findings of the investigation, that's a good question. There's a lot of them, and I think I'll focus on maybe the three biggest ones I think that are quite cool to know about. So the first one is a midwater sulfide layer, and it's the most bizarre thing when you see it underwater. So in 2019, we were diving just for some routine monitoring, and we came across this really smoky layer at about 14 meters deep, and it went to about 80 meters deep, and it formed this thick white cloud, and it was really spooky. As you dropped through this layer, everything just went white, and you popped out on the other side, and you're like, whoa, and you look up above you, and it looked like there was just clouds of smoke. And this is a sulfide precipitate, and this has happened around about autumn every year since 2019, and as far as we know, we're still the only people to have caught this event on video, so that's quite a cool thing. And how this forms is quite interesting. I won't give you the full story because it's quite a long explanation. But to summarize, when the lake stratifies, you get a whole lot of really warm water at the top, and you get a whole lot of dense cold water, the water in the bottom parts of the lake. And then the hot water sits on top of the cold water. So when the hot water sits on top of the cold water in summer, and you have all of the algal species and all of the phytoplankton in that top warm section, they all reproduce and keep recreating, and you get more and more of them. As they die, they sink, but they can't sink past this deep, cold layer of water. So they sit on the top of what we call the thermocline. And once they're sitting there, they start decomposing. And this decomposition, again, pulls oxygen out the water and causes a sulfide precipitate. It's a little more complicated than that, but in general terms, that's kind of what's happening. You've got this large amount of organic matter from phytoplankton and plants sitting on top of a dense layer of water, and then that keeps decomposing, and this forms this really smoky sulfide layer. So that was probably the most interesting, unexpected thing that we found in that lake. Another one, which is pretty dramatic, is the complete extinction of freshwater mussels. And we know historically that freshwater mussels occurred in this lake, and there were two species. There was Aotearoa menziesii and Aotearoa aucklandica. And we've been looking for probably the best part of 2 years to try and find decent mussel beds, or at least decent mussel shells, and we started doing full digging up surveys, like excavations, and we were finding these historic mussel beds that were about 200 meters square, just full of dead mussel shells. And this was a shame because it gave us an indication of how many mussels were once in that lake. And we estimate they're probably in the region of about 40 to 50 mussels per square meter, which is huge, right? And they can filter about a liter of water per hour. So if you think about that many mussels across a whole lake, all filtering water at that rate, they would clear up the lake in a matter of weeks. So all of a sudden, that entire filtration capacity of the lake is now gone. And since 2017, we've been looking multiple times per year and still have not found a live mussel or even an intact shell, which means these mussels died, well, decades ago. So we've seen a complete extinction in those, and that's a massive shame that we've lost such a pivotal species from that lake. And then the last thing is probably the macrophyte extent and the loss of macrophyte extent. So macrophytes are plants that grow in the lake, and the extent is measured in terms of the deepest point that you see these plants grow. So this we use as an indicator for a whole lot of things. So the deeper it goes, it means the more light penetrates to the deeper parts, right? Because plants need light. So before 2017, we were looking at macrophyte extents down to 12 meters. So this means lots of plants were growing up to a depth of 12 meters or more. Since then, in the 3 years that we have been doing annual macrophyte surveys, we've seen a reduction down to 6 meters. And in 2020 was our last macrophyte survey, and that still comes back at 6 meters. So that means now the maximum depth that we're seeing plants grow in is 6 meters. That's half of what it used to before. And, that's a pretty dramatic sign that something's going wrong here. And yeah, those are probably the three most surprising things for us. And I mean, it's a bit doom and gloom, but those were results that we weren't expecting to find.
Animals would you expect to find in the lake that should be there and shouldn't?
There's loads of animals and plants that live in the lake, and in terms of native species, we should be seeing bullies, eels, and kakahi, or freshwater mussels. We're not really seeing many eels and bullies anymore. Like, there is still a decent amount of eels in the lake, and there is a lot of bullies in certain pockets, and they're normally around the really rocky parts. So if you look around Sylvan Park, or as you're coming into Killarney Park off the jetty to the right, there's these rocky slopes that go down to about 14 meters, and you see quite a few bullies and eels around there. But otherwise, you don't really see many other native species swimming around. In terms of native plants, we barely see charophytes, which is a native New Zealand macrophyte. We barely see those. We'll see the odd sprig here or there, but functionally gone. Same with the pondweeds, which is another native species in New Zealand. We don't see any of those anymore, and those all used to occur in the lake in fairly high numbers. And as I mentioned earlier, kakahi or freshwater mussels are now completely extinct, which is a bit of a shame. The exotic animals in the lake surprise us every time we see new exotic species that we didn't think we would ever see there. We know that there's a large amount of coarsefish, particularly perch. Huge schools of perch. I mean, if you go for a dive in late spring, you'll see shoals of hundreds of juvenile perch swimming around. It's really quite a sight to see. The biomass is huge. There's a lot of tench. We don't see them that often, but we know they're there, and we catch fleeting glimpses of them. They're quite shy. They're not like the perch who will come and look you straight in the eye. So we don't get a chance to see many of them, but we have seen quite a few. There's rudd in there, which is another coarse fish. There's also koi and goldfish. So we've seen some fairly large koi in there in the past, which is not great. We've also seen red-eared terrapins, like those little red-eared slider turtles. So there's, we think probably about 5 or 6 of them that all hang out on this little rocky outcrop just north of the Killarney Park jetty, and we've seen them a few times. So that was unexpected for us to see little red-eared turtles swimming around. And while they seem cool, they all of these pest species have a massive impact on the lake. So everyone wants to see turtles, and that's fine, but we just also need to keep it in the back of our heads the impacts that these pest species are having. And while they're nice to look at, they're not the best for our native species. The exotic plants, as I mentioned, there's eelgrass everywhere, and that's a long, tall plants that you see along the side of the lake. Um,
We are looking at doing some riparian planting around our waterwise facility. What kind of plants should we be looking at, and are there special processes that we need to follow?
Firstly, you want to plant all natives. So we don't want to be planting exotic plants, and we want to try and keep everything native and appropriate to the site and the area that you're planting. One of the ways you can do this is look around at other parts of the lake that look similar to the site or the area that you're wanting to plant, and see what native vegetation is doing well and which ones are doing badly there. And that will kind of give you an idea of how to base your plant selection. One of the most important things is looking at the profile of your site. So generally, when you're planting on a bank or slope toward the lake, you'll have a flat bit where it's normally fully dry, and then a slope that goes down that meets the water. And each one of these three zones have plants that are specifically adapted to growing in these areas. And you want to make sure that you pick the right plants for the right zone. So some plants like their roots being in flooded soils all the time. So you'll plant those quite close to the water level. Some of the plants don't like having their roots flooded, but don't mind, so you'll plant those a little higher up. Some plants like having their roots in wet, damp soil, but not flooded, so you'll plant those further up the bank. And some plants don't like having their roots in flooded soils at all, so you'll plant those at the top of the bank. So that's one of the things to bear in mind, is just make sure you pick the right plant that will survive in the zone that you're planting it in. And then also just think about what you want the planting to achieve, right? So certain plants perform certain functions. So bigger, taller plants will provide shade. Smaller, denser plants provide filtration. Plants with lots of leaves often put organic material back into the lake, which is good for in-lake animals. Some of the plants along the bank provide berries and fruits or roosting sites for birds that like nesting in them. So just have a think about what your restoration outcomes are, and then you can try and pick certain plants that you put into the mix to achieve those goals. Positioning and spacing is crucial. So if you've got these restoration goals in mind, so say for instance it's to filter water coming into the lake, so you're trying to purify the water before it hits the lake. So you'll pick things like calyxes and you'll plant them close to each other, so 1/2 meter spacing. This means that once they grow, they'll grow into each other and they'll create a thick barrier. So all the water coming through there will get filtered by this thick barrier of calyx before it hits the water, and that will strip out all of the sediment and other contaminants from the surface water that flows in. If you plant them too far apart, they won't perform that filtration, so you want to make sure that you've planted them appropriately. As I mentioned, position, so where in the riparian zone you put them, but also position in terms of satisfying your restoration objectives. So if one of your restoration objectives is to provide habitat to birds that like riparian areas, you'll put certain tree species or certain plant species in the appropriate areas where those birds tend to hang out. If your restoration outcomes are to provide more shade to the riparian areas of the lake, you'll make sure that you're putting those sort of taller trees on the crests or on the top parts of the bank so they cast shade all the way down. So just position that stuff with your outcomes in mind. Please make sure that all of your plants are eco-sourced from the same ecological district, and there's heaps of information online. And this is just to make sure that you get plants that are grown from seeds that originated in that area. This will help with a whole lot of things. Plants that from seeds that were sourced from that area means that they adapted to that area. So they're more likely to grow better, they're more likely to be resistant to the local conditions, and they're more likely to flourish over time, which means better outcomes, less maintenance, all around just a better restoration. It also means you're not bringing in potential harmful things like harmful pathogens or bugs or viruses from other areas where those specific viruses and diseases exist, and they don't exist in your area, so you don't want to bring contaminated plants into your area. And then please get a maintenance plan put together, and this is one of the things we see all the and all of a sudden you're not getting a whole lot of weeds coming in and you're not getting a whole lot of dead plants anymore, but it's all kind of building up and becoming natural and it self-sustains, and that's what you want to do. But you want to make sure your maintenance plan goes up until that point.
Do you think that Roto is protected as it could be from human interaction?
I think the lake is fairly well protected from human interactions as it is, and there really isn't that much more that can be done. So if you look at the lake, there's the lake itself, and then you've got a whole lot of grassy parks, and then you've got gardens, and then it's just urban housing. So there's not a lot of intensive impacts from the catchment coming through. I suppose what would help is if you had wider planted riparian buffers or margins around the whole lake. So obviously, if you plant up the entire margin of the lake and create these filtrations all around, it'll filter any of the water coming in from the urban areas and the roads and that sort of thing, and that would make a difference and would add a bit of protection to the lake. But in terms of protecting it further from human interactions, I think the best thing that can be done is environmental education and awareness. And this is around two things. Mainly, I think the awareness around biosecurity risks. So I've spoken a lot about the impacts of invasive and pest species in the lake. And I think some of the human interactions that have caused this are things that we can work on to help protect the lake further. So things like the whole check, clean, dry process. So every time you get to the lake, or any water body actually, make sure that all the equipment that you're going to use at the lake that day has been checked, cleaned, and dried. And you make sure that you don't discharge anything, so don't backwash your pool or wash your car or anything near a water body or near the lake. Don't over fertilize your gardens, or don't fertilize your gardens just before rain because it just washes it all into the lake, and then you end up with that eutrophication issue. So, yeah, I think there's the environmental education around just how your actions impact the lake, and then the biosecurity risk is probably the next biggest one.
We are petitioning to have the government place a roto within the protection of the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park. As we described, there are many benefits to this. Do we have your support for the Pupuke Taniwha petition?
I totally support the inclusion of Lake Pupuke into the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park. I think this lake is valued by so many Aucklanders, and it's unique in Auckland. We don't have another lake like it. So while it is quite impacted and there are some issues going on in the lake, I think it's definitely worth protecting. It's definitely worth highlighting its value to people across New Zealand because it is really a part of Auckland, and I think it's a very precious resource. So yes, 100% support.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with us that may help in improving the Maori of Lake Rotopuki Moana?
I think the check, clean, dry message is crucial, and the wider you can spread that message, the better it is. So we just don't want any more biosecurity issues in any of our waterways, and spreading these invasive species from different water bodies, from different parts of the region, or even different parts of New Zealand is having such an impact. And once they're in the lake, it's almost impossible to get rid of. So we really want to make sure that people are aware of not bringing any foreign plants or animals into the lake. So that check, clean, dry message is hugely important. I think that will go a long way to protecting this lake. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's just general environmental awareness, especially when it comes to lakes, because people don't really think of lakes the same way they do of rivers and the coast. So lakes are basically a sink for the catchment, right? So everything that goes in there stays in there, especially Pupuke. Lake Pupuke's got no streams that come in or out of it. So everything that washes in it stays in it. So whatever we do now is going to be in that lake for a very, very, very long time. So just making people aware that lakes are really complicated ecosystems. They capture all of these impacts from everything we do in the catchment, and they're really, really hard to fix. So once they've took past a certain point, it's almost impossible to bring them back to what they were before then. So we want to be really proactive and really cautious about what we do around them, and just making people know that, I think, goes a long way to protecting the lake further. I think one of the best things you can do as well is And we can help you set this up. Aotearoa Lakes does this for heaps of people, where we can help you set up a monitoring program and a monitoring plan that you can use to engage other people in your school and get more people involved, more kids involved, more teachers, more parents, and you can get them all on the lakeside doing this monitoring. It seems like you guys are already doing some monitoring, which is fantastic. And that's a good way to make people feel involved in the whole process and get them to really understand and know the lake. And from that, they'll have a better appreciation and they'll value these systems more, which is great. I think the last one I would say is consider hosting an event. And again, we can help with this. So we're happy to assist you with all of this type of stuff. But have an event on the side of the lake where people can come down. We can get some guest speakers in to talk about their various experiences with the lake, the issues, the success stories, what can be done. You can kind of for future generations. So yeah, I think that's it. I just want to say thank you on behalf of Aotearoa Lakes and the whole team that's involved. This has been such a cool opportunity, and we really look forward to working with you guys more in the future, especially around trying to put together events and monitoring plans for the lake. And if we can provide any input at all, please let us know. We'd be more than happy to help. We think what you guys are doing is absolutely amazing and is crucial to protecting this precious, precious lake. So thank you so much for having us on, and we look forward to working with you guys again in the future. Cheers.
Thank you for all your advice and support, EB. We look forward to working more with you in the future.
Ngā mihi.